Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
The bill passed the Senate after 26 hours of votes. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power, as the president's big, beautiful bill clears the upper chamber here with a tie-breaking vote from Vice President J.D. Vance. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. We thank you for joining us. Kailey, this bill now goes to the House, where passage is not guaranteed. The next 24 hours ought to be interesting.
Yeah, the Speaker, Mike Johnson, certainly has his work cut out for him, keeping in mind he can only afford to lose 3 Republican votes.
That's right.
And there are plenty of Republicans who are vocal about, especially on the fiscal conservative side, feeling that this bill is too expensive and doesn't include enough spending cuts. And interesting, the senator that really made the difference in this vote today, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, even after voting for this bill in the upper chamber, says she hopes the House doesn't necessarily pass it as is, actually makes changes and sends it back to the Senate. She'd like to see it go to conference, which would mean that we likely don't meet the July 4th deadline.
That wouldn't happen, and I think that the Speaker's going to try not to let that happen. Tom Emmer, the majority whip, has sent out the alert. There is a vote that's going to happen, it looks like, in the House tomorrow. This was a close one, though, as I mentioned, 50-50, and it could be just as difficult to make this happen back in the House. They've already done this once, and it was a tortured affair the first time as well. Yeah,
and that process will officially begin just about half an hour from now. The Rules Committee set to convene at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. They'll, of course, put together the rule at which this will go to the floor, and then we'll see about final passage. So there's still clearly a lot of work to be done. We'll have the latest from Bloomberg Washington's correspondent Tyler Kendall live on Capitol Hill for us in just a moment. But we begin, as always, with a check on financial markets. And for a look at those, Charlie Pellet joins us from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much. Good day to you both. Indeed, Wall Street certainly keeping an eye on the latest developments out of Washington. Keep it locked into Bloomberg. We will bring you the very latest. Right now, we've got the S&P trading lower. It is a mixed market. The S&P lower by 10, a drop right now of 0.2%. The rally that drove stocks to records, losing steam. The Dow, however, up 327 off session highs, but still looking at an advance of 0.7%. NASDAQ down 137 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a drop of 0.7%. Our Mag 7 Index, particularly hard hit, down now by 1.2%. The 10-year, 4.25%. The 2-year, 3.77%. Gold up 1.1%. Spot gold, $33.40 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.8%, $65.65 a barrel. President Trump is threatening to withdraw government subsidies from Elon Musk's companies and examine the billionaire's immigration status after the Tesla CEO ratcheted up his criticism of the president's tax and spending bill. Tesla right now down 4.6%. Ford's EV sales dropped 31.4% in the second quarter due to a safety flaw in the Mustang Mach-E model and a shortage of stock on dealer lots. The United Health Group and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center have resolved a contract dispute that threatened to interrupt treatment for thousands of cancer patients in the New York City area. And it is now official. Zohran Mamdani won the Democratic nomination for mayor of New York City, extending his lead to 12 points over Andrew Cuomo in the primary. Recapping, S&P right now down by 10 points, drop there of 0.2%. Balance of Power continues now, and back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Checking on the markets for us. Meantime, here in Washington, we've obviously got about 100 very tired senators who just finished a lengthy vote-a-rama, more than 24 hours, ultimately passing, at least in the Senate, the president's one big, beautiful bill. The tax package, of course, passed through the budget reconciliation process. It was difficult, though. It required some deal-making to get specifically Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska on board, as the Majority Leader John Thune lost 3 Republican votes. Rand Paul of Kentucky, Tom Tillis of North Carolina, and Susan Collins of Maine all voted no for this package, leaving the Vice President, J.D. Vance, to cast the tie-breaking vote.
On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The Senate being evenly divided, the Vice President votes in the affirmative. The bill as amended is passed.
There you have it. Having spent a few hours in the Capitol before he had the occasion, J.D. Vance on Twitter, massive tax cuts. especially no tax on tips and overtime, he writes, and most importantly, big money for border security. He calls it a big win for the American people. Of course, this saga is not done yet. The bill now goes back to the House, where there is some consternation about changes that were made on the Senate side. And we want to bring in Tyler Kendall, Bloomberg Washington correspondent, who's live now on Capitol Hill to explore some of these changes. Tyler, what comes next?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Well, we are expecting the House Rules Committee to take this up. It will likely advance out of that, but then it advances to a full vote on the House floor, and that's where we could run into a little bit of difficulty. Now, keep in mind, this bill was designed not to be tweaked. It's not supposed to ping pong between the different chambers, but some of these more fiscal hawks, these members of the House Freedom Caucus, could potentially threaten to sink it, which would essentially mean it goes back to conference and the Senate has to get involved all over again. And it was actually interesting to hear from Senator Lisa Murkowski, who ended up voting in favor of this package, saying that she would welcome that if the House kicked it back over to the Senate with changes. Because at the end of the day, there is pretty broad support about those key pillars of the package that you mentioned when it comes to immigration priorities, defense priorities, of course, extending the 2017 tax cuts. But where these Republicans really were divided, particularly on the Senate side, was those changes to the spending cuts. And we even saw that in the 3 members that ended up dissenting and voting no on this bill. You had members like Senator Tom Tillis, who basically staked not running for re-election on his no vote for this package, as well as Senator Susan Collins, who both had raised concerns about what the changes to Medicaid could mean for their constituents, but square that with Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, who voted no on this package because he wanted to see deeper spending cuts and wasn't going to vote for any sort of legislation that lifts the debt ceiling as much as this plan ultimately does. And I bring this up because it was interesting to see what sort of compromises ended up having to be made by Senate Majority Leader John Thune in order to get this bill over the finish line. That includes doubling the Rural Hospital Fund to $50 million, something that you would have thought would have gotten Susan Collins on board, but didn't appear to be enough of a compromise. It also cuts a controversial tax on solar and wind energy projects and revises a food aid carve-out for Alaska in particular, which Joe and Kailey, as you well know, helped to get Senator Lisa Murkowski on board. Even as she says she would welcome some changes from the House, ultimately her vote helped to put this over the finish line.
Well, when we consider the political calculations that House lawmakers will now be considering as they decide whether or not to vote for this package, Tyler, how would a threat from Elon Musk to fund primary challenges to any incumbent who vote to impact the deficit this much factor in? Is he a voice at all that anyone is listening to, let alone President Trump himself?
Well, considering that he was the largest U.S. political donor in the 2024 campaign cycle, not just to the White House, but also to those down ballot races to a tune of more than $290 million, according to FEC filings, I think it probably does hold a little bit of weight around here on Capitol Hill. But as you're describing, it really does put some Republicans in a tough spot if they are between President Trump and Elon Musk, because Elon Musk has threatened to primary anyone that does support the legislation, in particular when it comes to rolling back those electric vehicle tax credits. And I'll give both of you a prime example that I know you're closely watching, which is Thomas Massie in the House, a Republican from Kentucky. We're not expecting him to change his vote when it comes to the House package. He's going to vote no. President Trump has already put some muscle, already put some money behind funding a primary challenger against him with a super PAC. But then we had Elon Musk, Joe and Kailey, yesterday in a post on X confirming that he intends to donate to Thomas Massie's campaign in order to give him a little bit of a funding boost against President Trump's operation.
Yep. And of course, President Trump now potentially suggesting having DOJ take a look at Elon Musk's companies and maybe even looking at deporting Elon Musk, though he's a U.S. citizen. We'll have more on that later in the show. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live from Capitol Hill for us. Thank you so much. And we want to add another voice to the conversation now, someone who has had deep experience on the Hill as a former 7-term congressman from Pennsylvania. Former Republican Congressman Charlie Dent is with us. He is now executive director of the Aspen Institute Congressional Program. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio, sir. Obviously, with this particular House of Representatives, which is where this bill goes next, we have seen two things be true. One being that the Speaker, Mike Johnson, is not afraid to allow things to fail on the floor, but the other being that President Trump can twist some arms, and usually people who seem like they're holdouts ultimately roll. How do you expect this to go down?
No doubt there will be a heavy whip operation. I'm sure the president will try to bully and threaten some members to voting for the Senate passed package. But those threats tend to work better with Republican members in very safe seats. I expect those folks in the safe seats who are making some noise right now will melt under the pressure from the president. The bigger question is the Medicaid changes that are of concern to many of the more swing district or more moderate members. Their problem is not going to be a Republican primary. Their problem is going to be potentially losing to Democrats in the fall. And so those are the folks I think they ought to pay close attention to. These Medicaid changes that the Senate went further than the House did on the Medicaid changes, and many House Republicans drew a pretty clear line in the sand on that issue. So I'm anxious to see how they navigate Medicaid. I could see this bill being changed once again and going back to the Senate. You certainly have fiscal hawks on the right who are screaming about this, but again, they're more likely to be pressured by the president successfully. But it's these more moderate members. Don Bacon, he could be a no vote. He's not running again. Tom Massey is an immovable object. He won't move. And I don't think the Republicans can lose more than, I think they could lose maybe one more vote, and that's it. And so I'm anxious to see how they do this whip operation.
Well, it's really interesting to hear you speak about this, Congressman, and welcome back. You seized immediately on the issue of Medicaid. Donald Trump knows what an issue this is. He talked about it on his way to the Alligator Alcatraz detention center in Florida earlier today. Listen to how Donald Trump put it.
I think so. I think it's going to be the greatest bill ever passed. No, we're not going to be playing with Medicaid. Only waste, fraud, and abuse. Americans could lose their coverage. The Democrats have it wrong. Promise? Yeah. Waste, fraud, and abuse. In fact, if you look at what's gone on, we've gone way back. We take care of Medicaid. We take care of Medicare. They will blow Medicare and Medicaid because they have no idea what they're doing. Just like they don't have any idea what they did on the border. They have no idea. Medicaid is in big trouble with the Democrats.
Charlie, Dent, you hear the Republican talking points on this, beginning with the president. Waste, fraud, abuse. No one's losing their coverage is what we've been hearing unless they deserve to, unless they're an able-bodied adult who should be at work. Are the American people buying that argument?
Well, the problem for the president is that the Congressional Budget Office came out with a report saying that somewhere between 8 to 14 million people, or 12 million people, could be losing coverage as a result to changes in Medicaid. And so that's a major problem. You can just say, hey, it's all about waste, fraud, and abuse, but we're talking about people who are going to be uncovered because of the work requirements, and also because I think the Senate, I'm not sure exactly where the Senate fell down on the so-called provider taxes that states use to draw down federal Medicaid dollars. But that's another issue. So the president doesn't ever get into the policy details. I had a big fight with him back in 2017 over this in the White House over, at that time, proposed changes to Medicaid. And then we were talking block grants. I told him it wasn't going to work, and he got pretty upset with me because I didn't vote for the bill. But I said that was going to cut over 20 million people from their health benefits at that time from Medicaid. So that's the challenge that the president has. He can talk all he wants, but as long as the reports out there saying over 8 million people are going to lose health benefits, they need a better argument.
Well, yeah, which gets us to the polling around this bill, which suggests that widely, no matter what poll you look at, it is more unpopular than it is popular. If the House ultimately is going to pass this and do so by July 4th, have the president sign it into law, knowing there will be roughly, 16 months until the midterms in 2026, how would the party need to course correct to change that?
Well, the party's done something here that I think I think this has been a miscalculation to put this all in one big, beautiful bill. I think that was always a mistake. The Senate always wanted to break this in two. You may recall in 2017, after the Obamacare repeal replace initiative failed, with John McCain going like that, turning his thumb down, then Republicans moved on to tax reform, or the tax changes, and they weren't dealing with spending cuts, just tax policy. Now that bill, was enacted into law. I supported it, but it really didn't help Republicans much in the midterm election. This bill is different because you are combining both what I could say are probably unpopular cuts to Medicaid and to food stamps or SNAP benefits and some other areas. And you're also extending those tax changes that largely benefit people on the higher income scale. And so that's the toxic political mix that Republicans are confronting right now. So I suspect between now and the midterm, Republicans will be playing a lot of defense. You may remember in the 2018 midterms, Democrats used the health care issue as a blunt instrument against Republicans in those races. I suspect Democrats will try to use health care and Medicaid in particular as an instrument against Republicans in marginal swing districts going forward.
Well, so where are you on the next 24 hours here, Congressman? You seem to think that the House needs to make changes. It goes back to the Senate. That means we miss the 4th of July deadline. Does Tom Emmer not have the votes as he sends out the notice for lawmakers to report?
Well, I bet today he does not have the votes. That does not mean he will not have the votes by July 4th. But there are, I think there are over a dozen members, House members, who've expressed some pretty strong opposition to this bill. As I said previously, I suspect those on the far right who are concerned about deficits, they will melt under pressure from the president. We've heard this before. They'll yell, they'll scream, they'll bang the shoe on the table. But when the president says, support this, or I'm going to fund the primary opponent against you, they tend to fall in line. The problem will be for these members in these swing districts, these members who are at great risk of losing their seats to the Democrats. Look, they can either displease the MAGA base, they can displease their constituents writ large. If Trump is mad at them and funds a primary and Trump's successful, gets a more very conservative person to replace that individual, that seat will probably be gone in November anyway. So that's the calculation here. If I were the president and running my whip operation, I'd try to figure out a way to communicate to those people and listen to them. Because, by the way, if the House flips, Donald Trump is going to have a really rough time in his next 2 years in office. I mean, you're going to see all kinds of oversight and hearings and people being subpoenaed. So Donald Trump better be very careful how he handles those members. Threats and intimidation tactics are not the way to handle them at this moment.
Well, and Congressman, if you were sitting in one of those swing states right now, knowing Elon Musk is threatening to fund himself primary challenges to those who vote yes for this bill, which he does not like, would that make you second guess your ultimate vote?
Well, maybe some on the hard right will, but at the end of the day, I think Donald Trump has a lot more influence with Republican primary voters than does Elon Musk. Now, Elon Musk obviously has a checkbook. But at the end, Donald Trump is able to rally much of the base to support his chosen candidates. So the Musk threat is real. I suspect Musk could help a Tom Massey, who will likely vote no. And there might be some other Republicans who vote now, who are now on the hard right, who could probably give Elon a call and say, I'm going to need your help, my friend. But right now, I'd say that Trump has more sway than Musk. But if I'm going to vote no and I'm in a very conservative district, I think that Elon Musk might be running to their rescue and might be able to maybe save them.
Fascinating. Charlie Dent, great to have you back, sir. Appreciate the insights. He's been there, as Kailey mentioned, former Republican congressman from Pennsylvania, member of the House Appropriations Committee, now executive director of the Aspen Institute Congressional Program. We've got some wood to chop here still, Kailey, as the bill heads for the House. You wonder, though, if just the hope to be home for the 4th of July is enough to actually get this over the finish line.
Well, we know Washington loves the smell of jet fumes. It can be a driving force. Also, on this bill, we should note, it's no longer actually officially called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Is that true?
The Senate was able,
call it?
Chuck Schumer specifically, to procedurally strip it out. You just call it by a number.
Really?
Right now. I wonder how that's sitting with President Trump.
So no more Build Back Better, no more Big Beautiful Bill.
Getting rid of the bees, at least for now. We'll have more ahead here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
And make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. Go to Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts for the latest on a bill with no name. And you can listen anytime at our website. It's Bloomberg.com.
When you consider the richest man in the world and his role in American electoral politics, knowing, of course, that Elon Musk, who I'm talking about, had a very public, very escalatory feud with President Trump just last month. It seemed that things had settled down. And perhaps now it's reigniting again, as Elon Musk is very unhappy with the reconciliation package that just passed the Senate on a 51-50 vote earlier today. In fact, Musk on X last night said that any member of Congress who campaigned on reducing government spending and then immediately voted for the biggest debt increase in history should hang their head in shame, going on to say they will lose their primary next year if it is the last thing I do on this earth. Of course, a statement like that does not go unnoticed by President Trump, who is now today threatening not only to have the Department of Government Efficiency, which Elon Musk used to lead, look into Elon Musk and his various businesses that receive government subsidies, but also didn't rule out trying to deport Elon Musk when he was asked about it by a reporter earlier today.
We'll have to take a look. We might have to put Doge on Elon. You know what Doge is? Doge is the monster that might have to go back and eat Elon. Wouldn't that be terrible? He gets a lot of subsidies, Peter. But Elon's very upset that the EV mandate is going to be terminated. And you know what? When you look at it, not everybody wants an electric car.
The monster that might have to go back to eat Elon. Donald Trump posting on Truth Social ever more about Elon Musk. He writes that Elon may get more subsidy than any human being in history by far. And without subsidies, Elon would probably, he writes, have to close up shop and head back home to South Africa. We assemble our political panel for their take on all of this, of course, against the backdrop of the president's so-called big, beautiful bill passing the Senate just about 90 minutes ago. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeanne Zaino, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and Republican strategist Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital, back with us here. Jeanne, what's this going to mean in the campaign season for an Elon Musk promising, as you heard Kailey mention, the last thing he does on this earth? How many members of the House and Senate could he dispatch?
Yeah, he's got a lot of money to spend, as we know. And I think it was just yesterday that SpaceX got like $80 billion in a contract from the federal government. So to Donald Trump's point, there's a lot on the line for Elon Musk, but he is committed to spending to defeat anybody who voted for the bill. We'll have to wait and see on that. But I just want to add this threat from Donald Trump about deporting Elon Musk, even though he's a citizen. This is not far-fetched. We just had a memo out from the Attorney General's office in June talking about prioritizing denaturalization of people who fall into these 10 categories if you lied during your process of naturalization and so forth. This is very dangerous territory. So not just for Elon Musk, but for any naturalized citizen in the United States, when you're talking about an administration that has recently jailed students for signing on to an op-ed. So it's a little bit more valid than we may believe. Hopefully it doesn't come to fruition, but that memo is very striking out of the Attorney General's office.
Yeah, it's a great point, Jeanne, and I guess that helps inform at least what an answer could be to one of our questions, which is, could President Trump even do that? But we also have a similar question around this idea of taking the Doge, targeting it at Elon Musk's companies, potentially cutting off government subsidies and contracts that the various companies benefit from. But Rick, when we consider that, okay, yes, you have Tesla and the question around EV subsidies and the like, what about a company like SpaceX, Starlink, which actually has national security implications, SpaceX being the only reliable operator to actually get U.S. astronauts to and from the International Space Station? Even if the government wanted to cut off Elon Musk, can they really afford to?
Yeah, I think that's a bigger question than the EV subsidies. That's a commercial issue. Elon Musk has all kinds of issues with the car company now. So setting that aside, he really is a essential element of our national security platform. The rockets that he uses, not just taking astronauts to the space station, but also putting satellites up in orbit. He is the one key transport system to put our satellites in orbit, including some of our nation's most secret technologies. So what are we going to do? We're going to say, oh, we got a fight going on with the White House, and so we're going to decapitate our capacity to launch spy satellites at a time when the world is at its probably highest risk point in ages. No, I don't think so. And don't even start about whether or not we think there's a useful national security component to Starlink, which has been essential to the Ukrainians as they battle the Russians in having, not been denied their ability to communicate. So A lot of this is just bluster. I mean, look, they love each other. They hate each other. They're loving each other. Then they hate each other again. I have a funny feeling this is going to be a cycle we go through all the time.
It's quite the sideshow here, although I guess Elon Musk might not be alone with the idea of denaturalization, as you discussed, Jeanne. The president was talking a short time ago at the so-called Alligator Alcatraz migrant detention center they're cutting the ribbon on today in Florida, floating the idea of arresting who we just learned today, officially, by the way, to be the Democratic nominee for mayor in New York City, Zoran Mamdani. Quote, we'll have to arrest him, he says, if he proves to be a communist. We don't need a communist in this country, the president added. We'll be watching over Mamdani, quote, very carefully on behalf of the nation, unquote. Do we find Elon Musk and Zoran Mamdani living in another country by the end of the summer?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds so far-fetched, and yet look at that memo. I mean, it is stunning. This is out of the Attorney General's office. And yesterday, when asked at the White House press briefing, Carolyn Leavitt said about Mamdani, yes, let's investigate it. You had a member of the House of Representatives saying that he could be denaturalized for something he said potentially on his citizenship form, which turns out to be based on rap lyrics in 2017. And it all sounds so, again, far-fetched and silly, but this is an administration and a president now, as you just mentioned, who are making these threats. And let's not forget, in the early to mid 20th century, you had about 22,000 Americans denaturalized. That subsided from the 70s on up. But it seems that we have an administration who wants to go back to something like that, whether you're talking about this person like Elon Musk, so important to our national security, as Rick was just talking about, or the duly elected Democratic primary winner in New York City to potentially serve as mayor. Stunning. And what about the rest of our friends and colleagues who are naturalized citizens? It's utterly shocking.
Well, when we consider how this question around citizenship, but also just wider questions of immigration and migration, knowing that President Trump was making these comments, Rick, about Mamdani in part, as part of wider comments he was making at this new Alligator Alcatraz facility down in Florida, how should we think about the administration's framing of places like that where they're intending to house migrants and people, talking about alligators being the kind of form of security to make sure that they don't flee, knowing they're also trying to message not just tax components of the bill that just passed the Senate, but the funding it would provide toward immigration and deportation efforts, funding more ICE agents and customs and border patrol agents and the like.
Well, this reconciliation bill, gives a big boost to the funding of those things, $150 billion of additional funds, primarily to the border security and immigration issues. So they're going to have a pretty good slug of cash to do the things that they're talking about doing. I would say it's a different issue as to whether or not you think it's a good use of taxpayer dollars to create a prison in the middle of the Everglades, in the middle of a place that has been ravaged in the past during hurricane season, and create a tent prison. Look, we all followed the news about shipping people down to El Salvador. Pretty much the same kind of concept. I'm going to pay millions of dollars of taxpayer money to incarcerate people in a foreign country. Now we're doing it in the sensitive area of the Everglades. Look, ICE doesn't have enough holding capacity for the people that they are arresting as part of their immigration roll-up. So something's got to give. And as the White House puts more and more pressure on ICE to deport and to arrest these folks, more and more we're going to see these kinds of issues crop up. I would not be surprised that this facility in Florida is not replicated in other parts of the country in the very near future.
Yeah. I was just going to ask about that because the president floated that possibility. Jeanne, he was asked by Peter Doocy at Fox News, is the idea that if some illegal immigrant escapes, they get eaten by an alligator or a snake? The president said, I guess that's the concept. This is not a nice business. Then he had suggestions for how migrants could outrun alligators, saying, don't run in a straight line, run like this, making a zigzag motion with his hand. if we start seeing these crop up around the country in our remaining moment here, Jeanne, what's the political backlash? I'm assuming Trump's base loves this, but the rest of the country might not.
I'm so glad you raised that. I saw him say that. It is utterly astonishing. We are a few days away from Independence Day, the 4th of July. The President of the United States, who cheers prisons by dictators in El Salvador, is visiting a makeshift tent where you put 5,000 people awaiting deportation in the heat of the summer in the Everglades. And the Attorney General, his ally of Florida, is joking just like the president. They don't have to invest much security in the jail because it's surrounded by alligators and pythons. It is time for Americans to ask who we are, and is this who we want to be when you look at policies and procedures like this?
Incredible that this is a conversation we're actually having. Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors, the both of them. Thank you so much for joining us here on Balance of Power, and we'll have more ahead on the budget reconciliation bill that just passed the Senate. We'll take a look at the math next on Bloomberg.
Investors have had their eyes on what's taking place today on Capitol Hill. Not decisive. The bill still needs to pass the House again, but we can tell you, if you're just joining us, the President Trump's big, beautiful bill that extends the Trump tax cuts and does a lot more has passed the Senate. It was a 50-50 tie broken by Vice President J.D. Vance. And Kailey, I was struck this morning by the chart of the day in Bloomberg Daybreak on the terminal. The Senate versions of the bill that just passed cost the bottom 20% of taxpayers an average of $560 a year, while giving an average boost of more than $6,000 to those at the top end. That's courtesy economists at the Budget Lab at Yale University, and it crystallizes the message Democrats are going to take on the road from here.
Yeah, in fact, they already have. And as we consider that messaging and the math behind it, we turn to someone from the Yale Budget Lab. Ernie Tedeschi is with us. He's director of economics there, also former chief economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Ernie, as we consider how Republicans are pitching this, J.D. Vance, who cast the tie-breaking vote, the vice president, as Joe just mentioned, says massive tax cuts, describing this on X today as a big win for the American people. How rich do you have to be? How much do you have to earn for this to actually be a win for you, Ernie?
Well, you know, this is a $4 trillion bill over 10 years, $5 trillion if they make the tax cuts permanent. And it's a massive transfer from the bottom to the top, because remember, you are extending the 2017 tax cuts, which helped everyone, but were still skewed toward the top. There are add-ons above and beyond the 2017 tax law that primarily help the top as well. And then to the extent that they are trying to pay for this, and again, they're not fully paying for this by any means, but the cuts to Medicaid and SNAP food stamps primarily hurt the poor. So net, like you were saying, this is, nearly $700 if you look at the bottom 20% of families, and then a $30,000 benefit net when you look at the top 1%. And that's not even accounting for tariff revenue, which is not part of the bill formally, but which the administration is framing as a pay for. And those are also quite regressive taxes.
So I'm guessing you would not have voted for the bill here, Ernie. The thing is, every time we spend time talking with Republican lawmakers, the conversation immediately goes to the CBO and how this nonpartisan operation that's been part of the process here for generations has been politicized and is looking at the wrong numbers, doing the math wrong. How do you respond to these constant attacks on the CBO and the suggestion that, you know what, Ernie, you're also wrong because we're going to grow out of this debt?
I would say, first of all, CBO, to anybody that's worked with them, knows that they hold analytical rigor and nonpartisanship as two of the highest standards for the organization. What's great about CBO is that they do things consistently and for the most part transparently over time. So you know that they are going to analyze a bill against current law, against the law as it is currently stated. That was not a surprise. As a matter of fact, this Congress, particularly the Senate, tried to come up with a different way of looking at it because they knew exactly how the CBO was going to look at it. It is perfectly fair to say that when you cut taxes, there is a little bit of a growth dynamic effect that, somewhat mitigates the cost. But tax cuts don't pay for themselves by far. Back when the 2017 tax cut was passed, CBO found that the dynamic effects of that tax cut offset about 20% of the cost of that bill. And that was when we had corporate tax cuts as well. Those corporate tax cuts were permanent, so they're not being extended in this version of the bill. It's just the individual tax cuts, which have much less bang for the buck. And so the dynamic effects, the growth effects, should be even lower than they were back in 2017.
Well, Ernie, that's an important point as we consider that this is not a package mostly of tax cuts. It's a tax extension of the rates that were set from tax cuts 8 years ago. So when we consider the actual stimulative effect that this is likely to have, does that basically negate it? Or should we be viewing this more from the lens, which is also a Republican argument here, that it's avoiding those tax rates going higher, which could have had a detrimental growth and consumption impact?
I mean, the thing to remember is that this bill goes above and beyond those mere extension of those 2017 tax cuts. So even if you had thought that those 2017 tax cuts, the individual ones that were expiring, ought to be extended, this bill as written is still about $100 billion more expensive than just doing that. And if the expiring provisions in this bill were made permanent, and if there's one lesson we've learned over the last couple of decades, it's that expiring tax cuts have a funny way of becoming permanent, then this is a $1 trillion bill, above and beyond just extending the TCJA. There will be a little bit of fiscal impulse, I think, in 2026. And I think that especially if you are the Fed, or if you are a macroeconomist thinking about your forecast, that's an important factor that will be somewhat offset by the effects of tariffs taking effect, right, which is going to have a detrimental effect on the economy. And so net, you have to think about all of these things in tandem.
Boy. So if you don't like this bill, Ernie, and you're worried about debt and deficits, was extending the current policy baseline the original sin?
I mean, look, I think that everybody, including markets, assumed that the 2017 tax cuts were going to be extended. And in the short run, that was probably not the wrong decision to make. I do have sympathy for the argument that if we had let them expire, that would have been a massive tax increase next year, and that would have created macroeconomic slowdown. The thing is
that they voted to use says it costs nothing because we're extending it.
Exactly.
And I'm still trying to get my head around how that works.
Exactly. The baseline tricks are funny. I like to ignore baselines and just say, look, what does the debt trajectory look like over the next 10 years with or without this bill? And with this bill, debt is growing faster than the economy still. It was already forecast to grow faster than the economy, even if the tax cuts had expired and we had, raised more revenue as a result. Now it's even worse as a result of this. And so, look, we can have arguments about whether it was correct at this point in the business cycle to let the 2017 tax cuts expire completely. But the fact remains that our debt trajectory is unsustainable, and there needed to be a better way, right, of making making a better tax code and for paying for that in a way that would actually reduce the debt trajectory.
Well, so when we consider that debt trajectory and the debt level, and then consider the level of interest rates as we factor in the payments we have to make on said debt, that's where you get to the argument that President Trump is now making, that this would all work out for the better if the Federal Reserve were just to lower interest rates and help bring down the cost of that debt burden. If we were to see a 25 basis point cut by the Fed this month or in the fall, if we see multiple, Ernie, how quickly would that actually make a difference as we consider the U.S.'s financial situation?
I think a small cut by the Federal Reserve would not make a huge difference. Remember, the summary of economic projections already has cuts baked in for this year. It's just a question of when during the year we're going to see of those cuts. And so I think that that's probably priced into the long end of the curve already. You would need a massive shock above and beyond what is expected from the Fed, to see movement on the long end of the curve. And even then, if investors perceive that the Fed is politically captured, or that the Fed is taking fiscal policy into it, going beyond their dual mandate and taking fiscal policy into account, right? Then further cuts by the Federal Reserve may be less effective than they've been in the past, because investors, may incorporate lower policy rates into their long-term yield forecast, but then they may inch up their inflation expectations and their term premium as a result. So this, even a Fed that cuts rates may be much less helpful to the argument the president is making than he thinks right now.
So is President Trump the real reason why the Fed can't cut rates?
I mean, I think that the Fed's dual mandate is very clear, right? They are concerned about inflation and they're concerned about employment, and they are stuck in a potential stagflationary shock right now, or a worry of one, right? So on the one hand, they are waiting to see the effect that not just tariffs, but immigration action and fiscal impulse next year will have on inflation, while at the same time keeping a keen eye on how those shocks will also weigh on the labor market. And the effect is the opposite, right? So if there's inflationary pressure, you want to raise rates or not cut rates. Whereas if the unemployment rate starts rising, much more than it has, then you want to start considering rate cuts. And that's a very tough position for the Fed to be in. It is, I don't think it is a simple matter of, the Fed needs to cut rates because other countries are already lower or because of something else.
Well, and Ernie, as we consider the kind of labor market element of the Fed's dual mandate and the picture of the U.S. labor market overall, getting back to this reconciliation bill, knowing it removes subsidies in a number of industries, including those intended through the Inflation Reduction Act to invest in clean energy, would you expect that to have a labor market impact, or at the very least mean that the U.S. cannot grow as many jobs as a result of this legislation?
I mean, I think that the energy side of the legislation could potentially raise energy costs, right, which is a supply side issue that the Fed is, famously concerned with. I mean, we have had inflationary shocks that have stemmed from higher energy prices in the past. I would also be concerned about the vulnerability of lower income families as a result of both this bill and tariffs, and how that flows through to the labor market. I've always been skeptical of the claims that, policy this year would lead to a recession, even when tariffs were higher than they are now, a couple of months ago. I'm not odds on a recession, but I do think that policy creates a macroeconomic headwind for the U.S. And, that's something that's going to be a major challenge for the Fed to navigate, between that and between the upward price pressure.
Ernie, it's great to have you back. Ernie Tedeschi, with his great analysis from the Economics Department, Yale Budget Lab, former chief economist, White House Council of Economic Advisors. Great to have you as part of our conversation, Ernie. If you're just joining us on Bloomberg, we've learned a lot since we took air at high noon. The bill passed the Senate that we've been discussing here, 50-50 before the tiebreaker from Vice President J.D. Vance. Now it goes back to the House. And Kailey, this is going to be the conversation for the next 24 hours. Rules Committee will have I'm guessing, a doozy of a hearing. They don't always see eye to eye, and they feel free to speak on that particular panel. And then the potential, at least, for a floor vote in the House tomorrow. That would make the deadline the president wants.
Yeah, the question is, will the votes be there, knowing that the Speaker, Mike Johnson, can only afford to lose 3 Republicans, and there's already a handful that are expressing dissatisfaction with the package that the Senate just passed. They prefer the House version. So we've got some reconciling still to do on reconciliation, and we'll give you another update at 5 p.m. Eastern Time for the late edition of Balance of Power right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
And make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. Between now and then, get to Apple, Spotify, or wherever you like to do your podcasts, and subscribe to Balance of Power. You can listen anytime at Bloomberg.com.